I want to go a little deeper into the topic of climate adaptation today and the role that land trusts are playing and can play in building resilience into their strategies and plans. Specifically, we'll talk about coastal resilience today because that's just such a rich topic. Of course, with coastal resilience, we're dealing with adapting to sea level rise as well as adapting to temperature shifts and habitat shifts correlated with that. So coastal regions really get a double whammy as far as climate change goes. And there are lots of tools and strategies that land trusts have been applying at different scales. So we'll talk through a few of those. So the goals of our conversation today will be to talk about what resilience is in general and how land trusts can scale those strategies and how they implement their own work. We'll talk a little bit about the Nature Conservancy's coastal resilience tools and analyses and how those have been applied in a case study up in Maine. So what is resilience? Coastal resilience specifically means securing the ability of our natural or human communities to bounce back after a disturbance. And in particular, in coastal areas, we're often thinking about coastal storms, flooding, and hurricanes that can wreak so much havoc on natural and human communities. So it's important to understand and consider sort of the landforms and configuration of our coastal areas. We know that certain geologies really hinder the ability of coastal habitats to move inland. So rocky coastlines are, of course, going to be very different from flat tidal expanses like we often see in the southeast. So being able to protect and accommodate the transition of tidal habitats as they move inland is a really important strategy. It helps, of course, with sustaining biodiversity as well as protecting built infrastructure, because we know that these coastal habitats, salt marshes and dunes and other near coast habitats are extremely important in also protecting our built infrastructure. So understanding just the extent and distribution and health of our natural habitats is an important first step in being able to then protect them. One of the things we know about land trusts is they often embrace themes with co-benefits. When we talk and think about the importance of protecting a given parcel, some of those themes that we are often discussed and that you all at this point have a lot of experience in thinking through are, of course, human resilience, how that property is going to aid in protecting built environments, contribution to flooding and water quality, habitat protection, sprawl management. In face of climate change, that sprawl management also might mean keeping people out of harm's way or keeping built infrastructure out of floodplain areas or flood-prone areas. And then, of course, equitable access to the outdoors is always a consideration as well. really, at this point in my career, what I've realized is climate is a new lens through which we view all of our work. And it it really is a consideration for every level of how we prioritize land conservation and how we address our strategies on the ground and all the way down to the parcel level, how we're going to implement land conservation plans or forest management plans. One of the strategies that land trust and land conservation agencies get to assist with is, of course, securing the science for conservation planning. The science of climate change is new and evolving. Protected areas offer really important laboratories, living laboratories for understanding how these changes are taking place in real time, that of course inform how we adapt. So I think, as often science-based organizations, these land trusts really do have an important role to play in contributing back to that science. Some cases it means engaging in citizen science opportunities. In other times it's simply finding ways to make their protected areas available to researchers that are seeking study areas. Another consideration that we haven't really delved into too much in this class is thoughtful conservation planning. The adaptive wheel of conservation planning and the scale at which it can be implemented is really important tool that land trusts can employ in setting priorities that address specific goals or perhaps even just their mission, and then of evaluating those priorities and readapting over time. So that wheel of conservation by design is one that I often share with my students, and it's something that we'll probably get into a little more at the end of this class. And land trust groups and land protection professionals really should familiarize themselves with just the wealth of information that's out there and publicly available, tools that are helping conservation professionals on the ground adapt and implement climate solutions. And at this point, it's mostly a matter of being able to wade through all of the information that's available and figure out what's the highest quality information and the one most relevant to the property that you might be managing or in charge of, or a landscape that you're trying to prioritize for. So these are just a few of those resources. You guys have had a little bit of interaction with some of these at some point. The South Atlantic LCC is one that we've talked about. And these are, of course, national data sets and also ones maintained by conservation NGOs like the Nature Conservancy. Another strategy, probably the primary strategy that land trusts can employ, is strategic land protection. So land trusts have the ability really to set strategic goals that are going to allow for really thoughtful and quantifiable outcomes that promote their mission. So if a land trust mission includes the preservation of biodiversity, um, really understanding where the biodiversity, how it's distributed across their focus area is important, and what kind of tools they can employ to actually target areas with the highest biodiversity and work with landowners that are going to allow for those areas to be protected. So we can think at multiple scales when we think about land conservation. And if you are putting yourself in the role of a land trust professional, one of the things that we would want to employ within our focal area is really to use some of that best available science to define an organization's priorities and where they would like to make their land protection investments. And this is happening all over the country. Climate science is being used by organizations and agencies to define where they work, where they do land protection, and to prioritize parcels within a focal area, or even just to define a focal area itself. And it's also being used to assess potential conservation actions and strategies where certain activities might be most important. For example, a land trust might decide that it's the most powerful tool for them to pursue full fee ownership of really sensitive and biodiverse areas, while they use conservation easements as a tool more in buffer areas around those sensitive biological hotspots. In addition to driving the work of land trusts, we know that these sort of tools are also being used by funders to prioritize where they place conservation funding. So since often that kind of funding drives the work of the land trust, it's clearly hand in glove to have both funders and land conservation professionals really thinking strategically about where we put our conservation investments. So a few of the high-level obvious strategies for land trust in the realm of coastal resilience is for land trusts to understand migration space, in particular migration space for coastal habitats that are likely to shift during because of sea level rise and or because of saltwater intrusion. Saltwater changes as they move further into freshwater systems. So identifying where natural solutions for human communities are likely to succeed is another strategy. Conservation of sites that are regionally significant for resilience and for diversity. And then, of course, also identifying maybe strategic restoration sites and strategies. So areas that might be in protected status but could really benefit from hands-on restoration to ensure that those sites can persist or reach their full potential and contributing to resilience of an area. Another strategy that land trusts can employ is to secure connectivity all the way down to the project level. Another side of the work that we often see land trusts engaging in is to be active participants in restoring or managing or helping to identify funding for the restoration and management of some of these coastal habitats. So what we see in this picture here is an oyster reef restoration project. Those reefs, of course, are man-made and put in place in an area where we're seeing some significant erosion. What we're likely to see over time behind these restored reef areas is that sediment deposits will increase behind the oyster sites, and as that sediment accretes, the marsh grasses will be able to, the sediment itself will stabilize into a soil that can allow for the growth and sustenance of those marsh grasses. In this kind of case, we might even have salt marsh grasses, Spartina plugs planted in behind the oyster restoration sites and really speed up that process of increasing the elevation of the site through accretion and stabilizing it by getting the native plants in place. I want to talk a little bit about another case study that I've had the chance to be involved with. This is a case study from coastal Maine, and specifically the Land Trust in Maine was interested in working on implementing some coastal resilience strategies within their geography and utilizing some of the Nature Conservancy's coastal resilience data to identify and prioritize some of these opportunities. Generally speaking, it's important to understand a little bit about coastal dynamics and ecosystems to grasp this work. But generally speaking, the way we can think about a coastal site is, of course, the physical site. That includes a set of tidal habitats. And in this study in particular, when we talk about marsh, we're really talking about the tidal complex that we see sort of along salinity gradients in a coastal system. So we see salt marsh to brackish marsh, tidal flats, beaches and dunes. All of these habitat features are part of a tidal complex. We know that in the southeast, we even see freshwater tidal areas that over time are going to be inundated and influenced by various degrees by saltwater moving into some of those freshwater tidal complexes. So this gives you a sense of the science behind this particular analysis. We've already talked about sort of that physical part of the analysis, understanding the space for migration and the potential for the establishment of future tidal marshes. And then an important consideration is the condition of that space. So it might not be enough just to have the migration space there. We need to understand that there's freshwater flow that allows for flushing and health, that there's a source of sediment that allows for accretion for these sites not to be inundated as sea level rise. We need to understand how much nitrogen is coming into the system. There's a balance there, too much or too little. And also, we need to understand whether or not we're dealing with hardened shorelines that are going to prevent for migration. But at the end of the day, once we look at all those factors, we can isolate and understand both the migration space and some qualitative information about the health of that migration space. So the 12 Rivers Group Conservation Initiative is a collaboration of 5 local and 1 state land trust in Maine. That collaborative has a vision of creating a network of conserved lands that protect mid-coast Maine's ecosystems and ensures multiple human benefits for generations to come. So it focuses in on an 800,000 acre area that has 46 municipalities. One of the things that this collaborative undertook was looking at current condition. They used quite a few different publicly available resources, mapping GIS layers that became sort of an indicator of what the current condition was and what areas were most important for protecting and sustaining some of these elements. So we know that spatial data has become so important in prioritizing land protection. These prioritization models are only as good as the data that they have been built upon. So it's really important for land conservation professionals to understand sort of the resolution and the quality of the data that they're looking at. If you look down this list of what folks were using to understand current condition in Maine, they're looking at indicators of threatened and endangered species, but also habitat models for organisms like horseshoe crab habitat. They're looking at critical habitat for Atlantic salmon, a variety of measures for seabirds and shorebirds, including some species level modeling. So you can tell this is a little bit of a kitchen sink model, but it probably represents for these land trust groups some of the best data and the highest resolution data that they could get their hands on to complete a prioritization process of what areas are going to be most important for protecting biodiversity in this landscape. Another important thing, of course, to understand was what are the future water levels going to be and the future land condition going to be. So they went from sort of understanding a snapshot, almost like a baseline, the current condition, to trying to use some of the best indicators to predict what that area might look like in the future. So in this case, to understand future water levels in Maine, they are working with some downscaled, created by the Maine Geological Survey, sea level rise scenarios. And then that, of course, is coupled with a national level NOAA's own sea level rise scenarios. And that's just a good practice to have more than one, if you've got more than one just sea level rise scenario or other data that you want to ensure you're sort of looking at those in tandem or understanding if there's agreement between the two. And then as far as the understanding the future land condition for this project area, they used a tidal marsh migration analysis as well as coastal undeveloped habitat blocks after 1 meter of sea level rise. And then they employed some of this resilience modeling that we talked about earlier. So that resilience modeling included these undeveloped blocks, which had been generated, again, by a state level, the Maine Natural Areas Program. Another analysis completed by the Maine Coastal Heritage Trust, the Marshes for Tomorrow analysis, as well as the coastal resilience model that we just talked about that was completed by the Nature Conservancy. They also wanted to understand some ranking of the human community. They looked at a downscaled human community analysis that had been completed by the Nature Conservancy of Maine called the Coastal Risk Explorer. They had two primary mapping goals. That was to evaluate and incorporate currently available coastal climate change resilience mapping into local and regional strategic conservation plans. They also wanted to identify and prioritize some sites for resilience projects, like a tidal restoration or a living shoreline site. So they were looking for this analysis to inform their work at two different scales, these data sets. And so they were able to combine the prioritization analyses really into one picture that helped to guide this collaborative in areas that might be most worthy of their investment in sustaining coastal resilience and biodiversity into the future. So when you look at this map, of course, the darker green show higher priority areas, and the lighter, the green moving into yellows is lower priority. One of the things that this land trust was able to invest in, which is pretty impressive work, in my opinion, for a land trust to be so engaged in thinking about hydrologic impairments and connectivity on the landscape and how they can assist in remedying this. You can see on the bottom two aerials that this is a snapshot of what had been an undersized tidal conduit, a bridge that was undersized for the tidal creek that was allowing for this movement of salt water with the tide. Up in this part of Maine, they're dealing with really high tidal amplitude, 12 feet on both sides of the tide. So what you can see was happening with this obstruction in the coastal area was that there was tidal scouring. When the water was high, a lot of velocity and water kind of getting trapped behind this obstruction, and we were seeing erosion of the marsh because of that impairment. And so by replacing the bridge and allowing the movement of water in this obstructed area, there was really quick restoration of that site, and you can see that much more naturally sized tidal creek in the picture on the right, and the restoration of the marsh grasses there because of the improvement in the flow of the creek. So let's talk a little bit about how this particular land trust was able to look at other potential restoration projects alongside the prioritization that they had built in understanding where they should be doing their protection efforts. So they happen to have access to some really great data that included stream barrier surveys, not unlike the one we just looked at on the last slide, dam locations. They had a data set called Return the tides tidal sites, and then also that main TNC human community resilience mapping. So as you might imagine, as they paired up these potential restoration areas alongside the land prioritization model, it gave them a lot of options in how they might think about how they're going to prioritize some of the future restoration sites. And there would be a few different lenses on that. It might be that they want to restore areas with the highest quality marsh, or that their efforts could actually increase the quality score of a marsh or the connectivity score of a marsh. It's maybe that they could have an influence actually on moving a lower priority marsh site to a higher priority one, because they would increase the condition score of a marsh site. So all these different possible prioritization options were out there for this group, and this was something they were still weighing when I had the opportunity to work with them. It might be that some of the most important restoration sites are actually around a lower quality marsh, but one that is providing some natural defense to a human-built community. And for that reason, it might be we prioritize even that lower quality site because of its benefits to the built environment. And that's all I've got for this particular case study. Let me know if you have questions.